We haven't heard about Spanish painting to date in this course. And in fact, the National Gallery has few Spanish paintings dating from before 1600 in its collection. The situation in Spain was analogous to what we have already seen in France, a country with a rich medieval tradition of art, but which in the 15th and 16th centuries tended to follow the lead of other countries in terms of artistic innovation. Thus, there was a lively school called the Hispano-Flemish School, which depended on the stylistic innovations of Netherlandish painting and adapted them to fit patronage and taste in Spain. However, the 17th century would see this situation change greatly as paintings by native artists flourished. While their styles were inspired by developments in Italy and the Spanish Netherlands, the final result was uniquely Spanish and represents a golden age matched by achievements in Spanish literature of this period. Ironically, this cultural golden age actually coincided with Spain's decline as a political and commercial power, nearly constant warfare with other European countries, and several outbreaks of plague took their toll. One large room at the National Gallery is devoted to 17th century Spanish painting, and it makes a powerful impact on the visitor. We'll just consider a few of the paintings from this room in this lecture. In the later 16th century, an important artist with an eclectic background came to Spain and helped to spark the development of a new style. This painter, named Domenicos Theotokopoulos, was called El Greco, or the Greek, and his dates were 1541 to 1614. Born on the island of Crete, he actually trained as a Byzantine icon painter there. However, he then went to Italy, both Venice, where he may have even worked in Titian's studio, and Rome. By 1577, he had arrived in Spain and settled in Toledo, formerly the capital of the country. Connections to Spanish ecclesiastical circles made in Rome were of great help to him in obtaining commissions for religious paintings in Spain in both churches and monasteries. He also painted religious scenes, private devotional works, and portraits for private clients. El Greco's Christ driving the traders from the temple from about 1600 is a relatively late work of the painter, but encapsulates brilliantly his style. The figures are elongated and show twisted poses in a late Mannerist mode. The colors are acid in tonality and limited in range, and the composition departs from conventions of naturalism. All of this produces a kind of hallucinatory effect. The story is told in Matthew chapter 21. Christ was infuriated by the profanation of the temple in Jerusalem by various traders and drove them out in an effort to purify this place of worship. Christ dominates the composition. He stands at the very center in a powerful, though unstable pose, and is dressed in cool red and blue tones. Sculptural reliefs on the back wall in this scene reinforce the message. To our left is the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise, a parallel story to the expulsion of the traders by Christ. At the right is the sacrifice of Isaac, which prefigured Christ's sacrifice. This is associated here visually with Christ's disciples as those who will spread the news of redemption by Christ's death on the cross and resurrection. This theme was the kind favored by the Counter-Reformation, for it emphasized the need to purify the Catholic Church and return to its origins, all this by analogy. El Greco found personal success with this composition and theme as well. 5 versions of it exist dating from the 1570s onward. This is smaller than some of the others. While he had trained in the art of linear perspective and European naturalism, El Greco in such paintings drew more upon the abstract style of the Byzantine icon. Here, for instance, his drawing of the floor moves upward too steeply to accommodate the figures in a real space, and thus Christ seems to float against the background. Remember how often we'd see that in Byzantine or early Italian paintings. The scale of figures varies willfully, and color is used more to convey emotion than to model forms. Spanish religious traditions were strongly influenced by mysticism, and this orientation probably enabled El Greco's greater success in this country than in Italy. Spain was not so insular, however, that its native painters did not travel. Giuseppe de Ribera, whose dates were 1591 to 1652, spent most of his career in Italy, yet remained a force in Spain through the export of his paintings and knowledge of his prints. Ribera was born near Valencia, but was in Rome by 1613, where he was strongly influenced by Caravaggio's art. In 1616, he moved to Naples, which was then ruled by Spain, and he spent the rest of his career there. The lamentation over the dead Christ dates from the early 1620s and certainly reflects the strong influence of Caravaggism. The dark background sets a somber mood for this painting, which conveys a strong emotion held in check by the personal dignity of the figures. St. John the Evangelist, in the shade, holds up the upper torso of Christ. The tender touch of his fingers around Christ's body and shaded face reflect his grief. Meanwhile, Christ's mother, Mary, bent in sadness and clutching her hands together in desperate prayer, looks at the body of her dead son. Mary Magdalene, who is posed on her hands and knees, leans over Christ's legs, preparing to kiss his feet. Each figure here is separate in his or her mourning state, suggesting, too, the separation of the dead from the living. The colors are rich but muted in tone. All is silent in an eternal contemplation of death and loss. Here is a painter who really understood the profound implications of Caravaggio's style for religious painting. At the same time, it is very much still a Spanish style for the kind of stripped down, austere approach to representation. Our next painter, Francisco de Zurbarán, worked primarily in the town of Seville, and Seville became one of the two most important artistic centers in Spain in the 17th century, the other being Madrid. Zurbarán, whose dates were 1598 to 1664, is best known now for his many paintings for religious institutions and private patrons. There are two depictions of the subject of St. Francis by Zurbarán in the National Gallery. We will look at the one that is probably the earlier of the two by just a few years, St. Francis in Meditation, from about 1635. In this work, St. Francis kneels, his eyes turned upward, but his monk's cowl shades them from our sight. His mouth hangs open, and only his nose catches the light. He holds a skull in his clasped hands, and his robe is patched and frayed. Removed from any specific physical setting with this figure, the emphasis is on the physical reality of the saint and the greater reality of his mystical absorption in meditation. I've used the word reality now several times to describe the art of Spain in the 17th century, and this was really almost an obsession with its artists. We can see dimly the marks of the stigmata, one of the marks, wounds in imitation of Christ's wounds from the crucifixion, that Francis received from God because of his great piety. Here, too, as in Ribera's painting, silence is paramount. The viewer is meant to be inspired to enter the same meditative state that St. Francis models here. If we recall from our study of Sassetta's painting in Lecture 3, St. Francis was originally a wealthy young man who gave up his worldly riches to be closer to God. This 13th century monk founded an important monastic order, the Franciscans. Here he is dressed in the patch robe and pointed hood of the Capuchin Franciscans. Our first thought when confronted with the style of Zurbarán's painting is to assume the influence of Caravaggio. And in fact, paintings by this master had already been exported from Italy to Spain. Yet there were also Spanish precedents, especially in Seville, for this stark, strong manner. Sculptors and painters in Seville were very much aware of each other's work. Painters were often employed there to paint the sculptures for religious processions and church displays. These sculptures were highly naturalistic and meant to elicit emotional responses. From the very beginning, then, Zurbarán's art seemed to reflect this artistic climate, and his figures were monumental, often isolated in space, and had strong drapery folds, all resembling sculpture. The most renowned Spanish painter of the 17th century, one ranked with the greatest European painters of the time, was Diego Rodriguez de Silva y Velázquez, whose dates were 1599 to 1660. Born in Seville, he studied with Francisco Pacheco, who was both a painter and an art theorist, and also became Velázquez's father-in-law. Velázquez became an independent master in Seville in 1617, specializing in religious painting and genre scenes. Pacheco's court connections and his own growing reputation led Velázquez to move to Madrid in 1623, where he soon became a painter working almost exclusively for Philip IV, the king. Velázquez would find great success at this court as both an artist and as an official in the household of Philip IV. He would concentrate most on portraiture, especially of the royal family, but also painted historical and mythological subjects. Rubens's art and career proved influential for Velázquez. Remember that Rubens had visited in 1628 the Spanish court, and the only Spanish painter he found to be of interest to him was Velázquez. The fact that Velázquez went to Italy in 1629, shortly after this visit by Rubens, indicates that Rubens probably encouraged him to do so, and Velázquez would make a second trip to Italy in 1649. The king and the painter had an unusually close relationship, and Philip IV actually aided Velázquez in his quest to be declared a Knight of Santiago, which finally happened in 1658. The National Gallery has a fine collection of 9 paintings by Velázquez, representing a range of subjects and phases of his career. We'll start with one of his early works done in Seville, the kitchen scene with Christ in the house of Martha and Mary. This would date from about 1618 and therefore represents the very beginnings of his career. It reveals his strength as both a religious painter and a genre painter, and even as a still life painter, and his awareness of Caravaggioism, though probably secondhand. The painting is nearly divided in half. At the left, an older woman points with her right hand while a younger woman works with a mortar and pestle at a table, though looking out of the picture. At the right side, the table holds fish, eggs, and garlic, a dried red pepper, and a jug. Above this kitchen still life and genre scene, we see a scene in which Jesus seems to talk to a seated young woman, while a second woman standing gestures towards him. This smaller vignette appears to represent the story of Christ in the house of Mary and Martha, as told in Luke chapter 10. Mary listened to Jesus' words while Martha continued to do the work of the house. She complained to Jesus about this imbalance. He was compassionate in his response, but also told her, Mary has chosen what is better. We are presented, therefore, with 2 enigmas. First of all, what is the nature of the religious scene? Is it meant to be a painting hung on a wall? We saw the same problem in the Parmigianino Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine. The style is sketchier here, and the light falls from a different direction than in the main scene. Or is it a serving window from the kitchen to another room? Or perhaps it is a reflection in a mirror of a scene taking place behind us. The second enigma, how does the smaller scene actually relate to the larger one? The young woman looks, pouty. Has she been chastised by the older one for not doing her duty cheerfully? Is the whole painting a comparison of the active life and the contemplative life and their interdependence for a pious person? After all, Jesus and Mary did depend on Martha's housework to enable their moments of conversation and reflection. The influence of both sculpture in Seville and Caravaggism is strong at this point in Velázquez's career. Look at the dark, somber coloring and the strong lighting on the figures. The naturalistic still life is in itself a kind of small masterpiece within the larger one. Yet the style of his would change soon after Velázquez moved to Madrid. The image we have today of Philip IV as a monarch is really one created through his portraits by Velázquez, which again follow the course of the king's career and aging. Philip IV of Spain in brown and silver from about 1631-32 exemplifies why the king would have been so satisfied with his royal painter. This is an exceptionally well-preserved work that reveals Velázquez's shimmering brushwork in the service of illusionism, and suggests that his study of Titian's paintings in the royal collection and during that first trip to Italy only a few years before had a great impact on his style. The king stands erect, left hand resting on his sword hilt, right hand holding a piece of paper. He is posed next to a table on which his feathered hat lies, and a curtain hangs behind him. As a full-length standing portrait, it derives from 16th century prototypes, but here it was simplified by Velázquez in ways that increase the visual effect and really make us zero in on the figure of the king. For instance, we are drawn to both the sword and the piece of paper. The sword magnifies Philip's authority as ruler as well as his nobility. The piece of paper has both Velázquez's signature and the word sir, señor, the form of address the king preferred on petitions to him. This emphasizes the king's personal rule. It was not at all typical of Velázquez to sign his paintings, so the suggestion might be here that Velázquez himself was petitioning the king on some matter. The inscription also indicates the painter's status, for he mentioned his role here on the piece of paper, painter to the king. The king's costume simply dazzles us. The painter ensured that we can make out the medallion hanging around the neck of the king of the Order of the Golden Fleece. This order had been founded by Philip IV's Burgundian ancestors and had long been considered the most prestigious chivalric order in Europe. Pigment analysis has revealed that the brown material of the king's vest and trousers was originally a bit more purple in tone, but the sumptuous display of silver embroidery throughout is still mesmerizing. But again, silver embroidery, painted, not including real silver. Velázquez's technique here, which emphasizes impasto, small areas of paint that are raised above the general level of the paint surface, helps to catch the light. Its technique is not precise or meticulous compared to other portrait painters. He somehow manages to convey an impression of the costume's detail rather than delineating every single bit of it. This ability of Velázquez to suggest rather than imitate enables Philip's countenance to hold our attention and gain our respect. His face is impassive, dignified, and powerful in his restraint. Once again, less is more, the lesson of 17th century Spanish art. A third great painting by Velázquez in the National Gallery represents the rarest side of his art, the female nude. The Toilet of Venus, or as it is often called after the residence of its 19th century owner, the Rokeby Venus, is really a marvel of painting. Velázquez's style in the 1640s and 50s was quite variable. Thus, it's hard to date this painting with any accuracy. A rough date is 1647 to 1651. It is also not clear whether he painted it while in his second visit to Italy or back in Spain. The subject, that of a nude Venus, was already well established as a favorite one in European art, and Velázquez would have known precedents of the subject by Titian and Rubens. Indeed, Philip IV owned many mythological paintings featuring a nude Venus. But it would have been almost unthinkable for a contemporary Spanish painter to paint this subject because of strongly voiced objections by the Catholic Church in Spain. The Catholic Church in that sense probably had sort of more moral authority than anywhere else in Europe. It is the only female nude by Velázquez that is still extant, though there are documentary references to several more paintings in the royal collection that featured Venuses by Velázquez, and they were likely nudes as well. Although we know that by 1651, the painting was owned by a Spanish nobleman, Gaspar Méndez de Haro, a recently discovered reference suggests that he bought it from an art dealer. Thus, the original circumstances of this painting's origin remain unfortunately unknown. We can assume, though, that the first owner was a sophisticated and knowledgeable collector. For Velázquez, painting comments visually on the tradition of representing Venus as a nude in a way that would most appeal to such a collector. For instance, a nude Venus who reclined was almost always shown from the front, but Velázquez has reversed this pose, invigorating the tradition by this very difference. It was also common to show Venus admiring herself in a mirror, but she was then usually represented sitting, not reclining, so Velázquez has merged two different Venus traditions in one. Finally, he indicated here that she does not look at herself in the mirror, but rather at the viewer standing behind her. We can tell this from the inclination of the head and the reflection in the mirror. This brings the subject and the viewer into a surprisingly intimate relationship given her pose that is turned away from the viewer. Just as Velázquez stripped away details from his portrayal of Philip IV, he did so here as well. Cupid and the mirror stand as attributes of Venus, but there are not her other typical symbols or accoutrements, jewelry, doves, anything else that can be associated with Venus. There's a beautiful simplicity to the color scheme here that is applied in sections. We have the red curtain, her creamy flesh, the white bed sheets that are covered with a gray drape. However, this last color has changed over time. Originally, it was more mauve in tone, adding greater warmth to the painting, and that also helps to explain the color of the reflections on Venus's back, which really don't fit very well with the gray color we see now. Instead of the impasto passages we saw in the portrait of Philip IV, here it is smooth, blended brushwork that has often been applied in long strokes. Velázquez has kept literal description to a minimum. Notice how indistinct Cupid's back leg and Venus's left foot appear. Some argue it's unfinished. I don't think that's true. The most intriguing detail is the mirror reflection. Its vagueness seems purposeful in encouraging the relationship of the viewer to the viewed by making us wonder what she is thinking about as she looks at us and how she is responding to our presence. A painting like this was clearly made for a male patron, as was true for the vast majority of paintings in the Renaissance and Baroque eras. While the chosen pose seems more chaste than a frontal nude, it is still clearly about eroticism. But the history of a painting's reception by other viewers means that different understandings can be brought to it. This beautiful and sensuous work of art was physically attacked in March 1914, only 8 years after being acquired by the National Gallery, and the attacker was a woman. Not just a woman, but a suffragette, a 25-year-old Canadian named Mary Richardson. It was one of a series of orchestrated attacks in 1914 on works of art in British public institutions, but this attack caused the greatest stir. Richardson actually had to break a glass barrier in front of the painting in order to reach the canvas itself, which she slashed through 7 times with a meat cleaver, focusing her attack on the upper torso of the goddess. Why did she carry out this act of mutilation? A leading suffragette, Emmeline Pankhurst, had been arrested the day before, and Richardson's attack was seen as retribution on the male establishment and what it held dear. However, she also later said that she was bothered by the way men looked at the painting. While the painting was able to be repaired, the National Gallery actually forbade entry to women for a time after this. Mary Richardson received a jail sentence of 6 months' time. What such an incident reveals is really the power of painting, a power that only the very greatest works of art seem to embody. Iconoclasm is the acknowledgement that works of art matter, even if their meaning is inconstant. Our last painter, Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, whose dates were 1618 to 1682, trained in his native city of Seville and became the leading painter of religious subjects and portraits there. He was one of the first 2 presidents of the new Royal Academy of the Fine Arts when it opened in Seville in 1660. A soft beauty and sentimental mood dominate many of his works, which made him popular right through the 19th century, but made him lose favor in the 20th century with modern writers. The fact that Seville was devastated by outbreaks of the plague in 1647 to 52 and again in 1676 to 1685 seems almost unthinkable when one looks at his serene paintings. Nonetheless, his mode was an important and influential one in Spanish art, and the National Gallery owns 6 of his paintings. The heavenly and earthly trinities exemplifies Murillo's international popularity, for it was an early acquisition of the National Gallery in 1837. It is an example of his mature style and has been dated from about 1675 to 1682, right during the plague years. The title refers to the fact that the divine Trinity of God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit, shown here as a dove, is depicted and then echoed by the earthly Trinity of the Virgin Mary, Jesus, and Saint Joseph. The divine Trinity forms the vertical axis of the painting, as was traditional, and is met by the horizontal or earthbound Trinity below. This was a relatively uncommon subject, the 2 trinities, one found primarily in Spain and in the 17th century. While not explicitly a biblical subject, it is derived from the account in Luke of a time when the 12-year-old Jesus remained behind in the Jerusalem temple discussing religious matters with the elders when his parents had already left the town after the Passover feast. Mary and Joseph had to return from Nazareth to retrieve him. And when they asked him with some distress why he had remained behind, he retorted, "Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house?" The story indicates Jesus' early awareness of his true nature and his destiny. The painting visually supports the dominance in Jesus' life of the divine Trinity. While both his earthly parents hold his hands and Joseph looks out to the viewer, Jesus' gaze is cast upward to heaven. Nonetheless, the painting does elevate somewhat the position of Joseph, so often cast in the shadows, or even omitted in depictions of the Holy Family. This reflects a 17th century trend in Catholicism to emphasize and represent Joseph more than he had been in previous eras, and we saw this once already in a painting by Barocci. Here Joseph holds a flowering rod. The Golden Legend maintained that Joseph was picked to be the husband of Mary after all the eligible men were called to the temple by the command of an angel, and his rod alone blossomed. The style is typical of Murillo, a balanced composition of beautiful figures, soft forms, and rich colors. Jesus looks much younger than 12 years of age, making him seem even more precocious and vulnerable. God the Father is surrounded by cherubs and the radiance of heaven itself, while the figures of Mary and Jesus are idealized and noble. This was Murillo's vision of spirituality as something embodied by physical grace and beauty. Perhaps we can be sympathetic to Murillo's sincere devotion after we look at his self-portrait from about 1670 to 1673. The seriousness of this image leaves no doubt about Murillo's dedication to his role as an artist. A frame painting of a man sits on a table on which there are several implements of a painter's profession: a ruler, dividers, a chalk drawing, a palette with colors, and paintbrushes. The painting stands on a curling tablet with an inscription in Latin, which can be translated as Bartolomé Murillo portrays himself to fulfill the prayers of his children. Murillo and his late wife had had 11 children. At the time this portrait was painted, only 4 were still alive. If we looked only at the figure of the man, we would see someone of great dignity and decent social status who looks slightly away from us, lost in thought. We would not assume he was a painter at all. Yet Murillo incorporated a bit of illusionism popular in Dutch and Flemish oval-shaped portraits of the same century. A hand that seems to come out of the painted image goes over the edge of the frame, thus breaking the barrier between the viewer's space and that of the painting itself. And remember, we saw that in both Carracci and Caravaggio. Suddenly, we read the image as not a painting within a painting, but as a live man standing behind the space of the frame. So vivid and convincing is the illusion as painted. The use of the hand to break the picture plane, when combined with the instruments of the painter, thus serves as a symbol of the painter's power to create a new reality with his mind and his hand working in concert. The most debilitating war that Spain waged in the 16th and 17th centuries was a civil war, the 80 Years' War of the Netherlandish provinces against the rule of Spain. Well, as we have seen, the southernmost provinces were kept as part of the Spanish kingdom. The northern provinces had managed to break away by the end of the 16th century. The war continued, however, until a peace treaty was signed at Münster in 1648. It would be appropriate now, therefore, to turn to painting in the new country, the United Provinces.